The Ottomans were by far the most successful regime ever to emerge in the Muslim world, writes Frank Fukuyama in his political science classic, The Origins of Political Order. The Ottomans developed state institutions that were strikingly modern, a centralized bureaucracy, and the military based on impersonal criteria of merit. The Ottomans had in turn learned from the Mamluks in Egypt their solution to the problem of modern state building. That is, the need to move beyond the elites that dominate society, in their case, the landed aristocracy, was to recruit slaves to the military, to the bureaucracy. The Mamluks, who were, after the Abbasids actually, the original, with whom the system originated, had actually been Turks. Sultan Baybars, who was mentioned recently here, he was a Kipchak Turk, or Kalmuk Turk, from the Black Sea region, who had been sold as a slave and eventually ended up in Egypt. And the state that the Mamluks founded, the Mamluks, that is the Turkish slave soldiers from the Black Sea region, it was actually the first Turkey. It was the first state known in history that officially declared itself Turkey. They called themselves Türkiye Devleti. Actually, the first time ever that Turkey is mentioned in a historical record is not in Egypt, certainly not in what is today Turkey. It's actually what is today Hungary, to whom the Byzantines referred to in the first Latin historical record mentions what is Hungary today as Turkey. Turkiya. So, since there has been some discussion going on about what Turkey doesn't want to be called Turkey anymore, it's called Türkiye, they actually took it from the French. And Turkey has been, this is kind of a funny country that moves around. It starts in what is Hungary, then moves on to Egypt, and then finally it has now ended up in Anatolia. And back to the Ottomans, their slaves were not Turks. They were Christians, principally from the Balkans, from Hungary, and from the Black Sea region, Ukraine, Caucasus. In The Prince, Machiavelli wrote that there is no ancient blood nobility in what he called the monarchy of the Turk. Indeed, and ironically, the Turkish aristocracy had been marginalized, crushed by the Ottomans, by the Sultan Mehmed II, who conquered Constantinople, who in Western eyes personifies the conquering Turk, was actually the Sultan who took the first steps, decisive steps, to marginalize the Turkish landed aristocracy in Anatolia. Between the year of 1453, the capture of Constantinople, to 1614, of the 57 grand viziers, prime ministers, who ruled the Ottoman Empire, out of the 57 grand viziers, only 5 were Turks, which gives you a sort of a sense of the marginalization of the ethnic Turkish aristocratic element. Now, echoing earlier Middle Eastern regimes, notably the Persian ideal of the absolute monarchy, the Ottomans saw their function as the protection of ordinary subjects against the rapacity of oligarchic elites. They did this not necessarily out of a sense of fairness, but because they recognized that the elites in society needed to be checked if the state, in turn, was to be strong. This is like in Sweden in the 17th century, when the monarchy clipped the wings of the aristocracy and sided with and protected the peasantry, laying the foundations of sort of the modern Sweden. The need for restraint, justice, in this sense meaning moderation in taxation of the peasantry, was a cornerstone of Ottoman state theory. Ottoman writers wrote about the circle of equity. They started by saying that there can be no military without wealth. The peasantry produces the wealth. The sultan keeps the peasantry, or as they called it, reaya, by making justice reign. But the whole system, this wonderful system, lasted only for about 300 years. It fell apart, and with it, nearly the empire itself. During the great crisis of the 17th century, which was not only an Ottoman phenomenon, but it was, as we know, a global phenomenon. It affected empires and states from Europe all the way to China. It was when the Ottoman military expansion had come to an end, and the crisis was exacerbated by the great environmental and demographic crisis of this century. It led to anarchy. Out of anarchy rose the local elites rose. Local elites were empowered. And with that, the exploitation of the peasantry, the restraints the restraints on the exploitation of the peasantry ceased to function. The effects of this overhaul of the Ottoman system, the fall of the Ottoman system, were particularly fatal in the Balkans, because in the Balkans, Muslim landlords were pitted against landless Christian peasants. So what was actually a class conflict between landlords and landless peasants turned into a ethno-religious conflict, because the landlords were Muslim and the peasantry was Christian in the Balkans. And from there you have the birth of Greek nationalism, Serbian nationalism, all these nationalisms that kind of implode. As a result, the empire imploded. But it took a long century, what's called the long 19th century, for the Ottomans to end. They proclaimed the equality of all citizens. They tried to foster Ottoman nationhood, but they were unsuccessful. The Muslim landlords, the local elites in the Balkans, could not be checked, were not checked. The Balkans were lost. The empire turned into a predominantly Muslim empire consisting of Anatolia and the Middle East. And what had started, from having started checking and crushing the Turkish aristocracy, the Ottomans ended up midwifing a Muslim Turkish bourgeoisie. The Armenian genocide and the ethnic cleansing of the Greek Orthodox population produced the dowry of the new republic. All that wealth was transferred to a new Muslim Turkish business elite. This economic elite, in turn, has for the last century enjoyed superior access to the political system and used this access to entrench itself. Most successfully so during the last quarter century, when Turkey has been ruled by a fake populist who disingenuously has pretended and continues to pretend to speak for the people against the elite. A Trump, if you want, before Trump. Now, as an indication of what has happened during the last quarter century, let me quote myself here. The bottom half earners of Turkey possess only 4% of the country's wealth, whereas the wealthiest 10% owns 67% of that wealth. This is, the legacy of the Erdogan regime. The Ottomans ultimately failed to ensure the autonomy of the state from the wealthy elites. This, I would argue, is they failed to protect. This, I would argue that it was their inability to protect and preserve the larger public interest that doomed them. And that, in turn, I would argue, is something that is a lesson also for liberal democracies today. And there I will stop. Before time, it seems.